There was a news story that flew under the radar last week that shows how the Kremlin is in a vulnerable position. And indeed, the Kremlin is taking a risk not seen since at least the start of the Kursk incursion, and perhaps not since all the way back in the fall of 2022. These are the choices that the Kremlin has to make, and there is still a big question mark on what may happen. But I am getting ahead of myself. I guess that the situation is fitting, because it is all of these explosives flying under the radar, or otherwise evading Russian air defenses, that is what precipitated the Kremlin's move. These are all of the verified attacks on Russian oil and gas infrastructure since the beginning of August, presumably with Ukraine as the perpetrator. The map does not include attacks on Russia's energy grid or military depots or warehouses, which, at least by my anecdotal reading of reports, have also been increasing as of late. The critical takeaway here is not just the stunning quantity of attacks. It is also that they do not seem to be slowing down over time. Usually when a country finds a new exploit like this in a war, once that exploit is out in the open, the opponent finds countermeasures to mitigate the damage. Apparently not so here, or at least not yet. At the surface level, we all know that the primary reasons this has worked are 1. Ukraine has a massive drone program that it is very proud of, and 2. Russia has insufficient air defenses to cover its yawning territory, ironically reversing one of Russia's traditional strengths. But at the risk of getting meta and citing a second news story that also flew under the radar, this Financial Times report from a couple of weeks ago claims that the United States has been supplying Ukraine with intelligence about the location of Russian air defenses after a late July phone call between Trump and Zelensky. You may remember that there was a Reuters report a bit further back claiming that such intelligence sharing was about to start, and I did a video about how that would help Ukraine. Basically, if you tell Ukraine where Russia's air defenses are today, then Ukraine can program its drones to simply go around them, or hit the unguarded targets of the day. Voila, huge fires in Russia. Anyway, in that video, I mentioned the possibility that the Reuters source misunderstood what was happening, and that intelligence sharing was already underway, and that explains the uptick in successful strikes since August. Well, the Financial Times report indicates that the second possibility that I offered was the correct one. I do not think that the broader public fully appreciated the significance of the timing, though. Remember, the intel started by the beginning of August. The Alaska summit between Trump and Putin was held on August 15th, meaning that as the two leaders were meeting, Trump was secretly passing along information to Ukraine about how to destroy Russia's energy infrastructure. It is interesting to reflect back on this with 2020 hindsight, given that the prevailing narrative on social media was that Trump was selling out Ukraine. I distinctly remember Rubio repeatedly getting asked about this on the Sunday morning talk shows immediately following the summit. He kept getting frustrated with the question's premise, and it is understandable now why. Look, I get that in a world of extreme political partisanship, finding shades of gray is not a great way to amass viewership. But it is possible that the Trump administration can cause Ukraine a whole bunch of frustration, while simultaneously still assisting in the war effort, and not be in bed with the Kremlin. Obviously, diplomatic relations were much calmer when Biden was in office, but Biden was also adamantly against targeting Russia's oil infrastructure, whereas now the Trump administration is helping to destroy it, and the whole campaign is seemingly on the verge of becoming the most important part of the war. Anyway, the point is that the map of Russia, as the Kremlin sees it, currently looks like this, and Russia's pace of advance in Ukraine is slowing. Now, how much of that is a product of Ukraine improving its defenses, and how much of that is a change in the weather is unclear. But at least for the next few months, the primary domain of this war may very well be in the air. Of course, the Kremlin understands this new orientation, which takes us to the story not receiving enough attention. For those of you who have been carefully following this war for the past few years, you will remember during Ukraine's fall 2022 counteroffensive that Russia scrambled to amend Federation law to annex the 4 eastern oblasts. This was an act of legal trickery. If those 4 oblasts were a part of Russia, then the Kremlin could deploy its regular soldiers to defend them. This, in conjunction with the mobilization announcement seen here made about a week beforehand, allowed the Kremlin to flood new soldiers into Ukraine. That, in turn, stemmed the tide of Ukraine's offensive, eventually froze the front line, and then transitioned us into the current Russian creep. However, this was also the most dangerous political period that the Kremlin encountered during the war, at least so far. Those soldiers did not ask to go over there. They were being forced to. And they were not being paid for the risk that they were undertaking either. As a result, potential call-ups started going into hiding, or outright leaving the country. It was destabilizing inside of Moscow, and there was a broader risk of an economic catastrophe if all of the workers started to disappear. Consequently, the Kremlin pulled an about-face halfway through the mobilization. There is a common perception that the Kremlin completely controls the information space inside of Russia, but that is just not right. The Kremlin tried to be sure, but it failed to get the Russian people to accept its preferred narrative. In a significant revision to Kremlin policy, soldiers were no longer forced to go to Ukraine. Instead, they went on a voluntary basis. Recruitment offices began paying the appropriate risk premiums to attract warm bodies. That has kept things stable in the Kremlin ever since, despite the Putin is done subgenre that receives way too much attention. So, just to visualize the problem thus far, if we have a continuum of recruitment strategies, with totally forced mobilization on the left, and voluntary mobilization on the right, we know that the forced mobilization strategy does not politically work for the Kremlin, but the voluntary mobilization strategy does. At least as long as the money is there, anyway. We got our next bit of information along this continuum in 2024, when Ukraine invaded Kursk. Now, Kursk is a part of internationally recognized Russia. It would stand to reason that regular Russian soldiers, who are supposed to be pressed into action when the homeland comes under attack, would have no problem indeed coming to the rescue. But nope. The Kursk incursion was a direct consequence of the special military operation in Ukraine. Again, commanding conscripts into combat in Kursk was controversial. Putin preferred to pass on potential political problems. Like before, after the initial deployment strategy tried and failed, voluntarily recruited soldiers had to deploy to Kursk instead, and also North Korean soldiers. So, along this spectrum, in-country deployments were also a no-go, at least as long as they were dangerous and connected directly back to Ukraine. But now the Kremlin is taking a stab at the unknown region. Here is the basic idea. As this timeline of attacks illustrated, Russia is doing a poor job of defending key installations inside of the country, whether we are talking about the oil and gas targets here, or its own electrical grid or military production facilities. Part of the problem seems to be a lack of air defense assets, which is not something that any of the choices along the manpower deployment spectrum can directly solve. However, you might recall from our discussion of Ukraine's air defense plan that it is possible to have troops use large-caliber machine guns to shoot down drones, especially as they get close to their targets and begin their final descents. There are some reports out of Moscow that such units, essentially men with pickup trucks, guard the Kremlin. I will have to go into greater depth about how exactly Ukraine conducts these attacks in a future video. But the point is, for now, that the Kremlin must look at where all of the prime targets in the country are, and surround each of them with a pool of a couple million soldiers. Specifically, Russia plans to use some of its 2 million reservists for this new scheme. Now, these reservists previously signed voluntary contracts, so they are not exactly being pressed into duty, unlike the fall 2022 mobilization. But they might not have imagined that they would be assigned another task directly related to the special military operation. As a result, you might be tempted to think that this is liable to induce thousands of ordinary Russians to pile onto the streets of Moscow in protest. However, before we conclude that this is Kursk Part 2, let's note that we are in the nebulous zone. These soldiers are at a relatively low risk of death because they will not be drawing any direct fire. They are also only supposed to be deployed from their own regions, and so it should be fairly easy to rotate these deployments. But the Kremlin is still pulling the reservists away from their normal jobs and away from their families. And thus, we will all soon learn whether that falls below or above the acceptable cut point to the Russian public. And if you will indulge me in a rant for a minute, that is why I am done with the Putin is done subgenre. I understand why folks in the Western coalition want to have a sense of optimism in their lives. But there is a big difference between optimism and false optimism. If the conclusion to be drawn from a situation like this is that the Kremlin is in a hopeless position, think about what that tells Ukraine supporters what they should do in response. They should take it easy. There is no need to press on the accelerator if doing so is expensive, which it is, and Putin is done either way. Forget about failing to deliver on what the Putin is done promoters promise. They are not even giving you the correct policy recommendations. Actually, their silliness obscures the hard work that goes into confronting the difficult problems that will actually make a difference in this war. And that is where there needs to be more public support, because it can matter, but it also requires some buy-in from the public to continue receiving political and financial support. Meanwhile, I do not actually need your financial support, but these 2 books on the war are still pretty cool, and you should check them out. I would tell you that Lines on Maps is done if you do not get one today, but that would be dishonest, and I am here to provide you sober information about what is actually true. Anyway, check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.